Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks for coming to this workshop that we're doing as a pre-nationals workshop. My name is TJ. I'm part of the CAP of the upcoming Malaysian Nationals IB, and doing this workshop as a way to promote development for not just novice debaters, but also for the future of the varsity debate circuit in Malaysia. So today we'll be looking at a case preparation workshop, specifically on the motion "This House supports progressive abandoning political moralism." It's actually a motion that was done at UADC. I had the good fortune of judging the round where this motion was debated, and I quite liked it and the discussion associated with it. So that's why I chose it to do the case prep session. Again, for those who just came in, I've sent a link to the chat, which is basically a form. If you have any questions throughout the workshop, at any point, feel free to unmute yourself and ask those questions or put it in the chat. Alternatively, if you wish to remain anonymous or you want to save them for later, you can put them in the form and I'll have a look at them at the end of the session. Okay, so let's get started. So case prep. So this workshop is going to look very specifically at the process of constructing a case. So British parliamentary debate, you will get 15 minutes of prep time. You won't have a lot of time to sit down and discuss things, especially if you're used to the 30 minutes prep time of Asian parliamentary. So it's important that you use this time wisely and to maximize the value of it. So whenever you get a motion, there are a few things or a few steps that debaters at the highest level, there's things that we do across the board, across the many people that I've debated with or debated against. There are a few things that are that we all do in common. This is what we call the basics of debating, and the basics of case prep is what the primary thing, the most important thing that you need to focus on in order to construct a winning case. So when you first get a motion, things that you should not do: jump straight into arguments or ideas, start preempting stuff that your opponents might say, or like panic and have a meltdown, especially if you like a motion on like the Taliban or something you're not very familiar with. Don't do that. Instead, you should break down the context of the debate to identify the problem or the central question to be answered or to be solved by the motion. Then identify the primary comparative in the round, and then identify your burdens of proof. So it's a more structured way of going about case prep. So you have a starting point for the discussion with your team. You all can start on the same page and then start working towards a common like conclusion or idea, set up a strong stance and a case line. And that increases or maximizes the chance of you winning significantly when everyone and all members of the team are on the same page. There are 5 parts to case construction. You don't have to do them in order. And personally, I mix up the order depending on what I'm doing or how I'm feeling at the time. But these are things that need to be done in whichever order they need to exist and emerge in your case prep. The first thing we're going to look at is motion decomposition. It's essentially where we break down the words in the motion to identify what the context of the debate is and what the problem of the debate to be solved. Especially important in debates where you may not be very familiar with what the debate is trying to talk about. So maybe some niche IR motion, for example, you still can construct a pretty strong case just on the sole basis of first principles. But in order to identify the central clash, you need to do the motion decomposition. That's what that's about. The second thing then is the comparative identification. What is the two worlds in this debate? What is the comparative? What is the trade-off that exists in the round? Being aware of those things allow you to focus your analysis on proving exclusive conclusions, so you don't waste time proving things or talking about things that your opponents are not going to challenge, or things that are going to exist symmetrically in the round that are not exclusive towards either side. Being aware of the comparative, being able to identify it, and specifically also be aware of how the comparative evolves and shifts through responses during the debate itself. It's a very important part of case prep. The third thing is burden identification. After you do comparative analysis, what then do you need to prove to win the round? Fourth then is modeling or word building. And fifth is the argument generation and argument construction. So let's go through these things. Motion decomposition, breaking down the debate to its core. So as I said earlier, what motion decomposition is to decompose or to break down the words in the motion to identify the context and the characterization in the round. So in a motion, this house supports progressive abandoning political moralism. There are basically three components that needs to be explained. First is progressives, second is abandoning, the action term, and the third is political moralism. So let's look first at progressive. Who are progressives, right? And this, in terms of identifying the question to ask, you can ask any question at all that's related to this. So when we talk about progressive, the most obvious question is who they are, what do they do, what do they stand for? Asking and answering those questions helps you to identify the context and the characterization of the round. So who these progressive are, they're probably people at the left end of the political spectrum. They usually support more liberal values, things like social justice, socialist policies, etc. Progressives are often contrasted to centrists or conservatives, centrists being people that sort of sit in the middle. They are the moderates, they're the people that don't really have any strong political ideology and would just go with politicians or political parties that are more likely to provide them with what they need at any particular point in time. They don't really hold very strong values, which is why they sit in the center. Conservatives are sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. So if on the left side, you have progressive and liberals, on the right side, you have conservatives and right-wing people. So conservatives are usually less open to change. They usually support the status quo, however bad it may be. They are also usually a bigger fan of business-friendly policies, so reduced taxation and stuff, which is why a lot of progressives are a lot of conservatives are pro-capitalism, even though capitalism is probably not a very good economic structure to have in the world if you look at the way wealth is unequally distributed across the board. Political ideologies, they exist for a wide variety of reasons. The biggest reason why they exist or how they propagate is through environments and community. So people that are born in certain communities are more likely to espouse those values. Most debaters are probably leaning on the left, to the far left side of the progressive, of the political ideology. We are very pro-social justice, we are pro-unions, anti-corporation. These are all common values that most people hold as debaters, and that's usually what defines us as progressives. So that's what progressives are. Abandoning is just basically to turn away from. So it implies two things. One, that is being done in the status quo, which is what the opposition has to defend. They can't defend something else. But also, it implies that we are not preferring a world where these things never happened before. We are supporting a shift or a pivoting from what was done in the past to changing something being done in the future. So that's the nuance of the word abandon. And I think usually the action word is quite straightforward, but probably still worth looking at just for the sake of this. The last thing then is political moralism. So political moralism essentially is morality in politics. So it's like judging or evaluating choices that are made, actions that are taken in the political sphere. Like politicians, for example, if they make certain choices, both in public or in private, very common example is public figures sort of tweeting something homophobic, like J.K. Rowling saying that, what's that? A TERF essentially supporting trans exclusionary radical feminism. And the latest one is Dave Chappelle. He said apparently he's joining Team TERF as well. So probably gonna be outed or cancelled soon. But basically, this is what it means to have political moralism. It is to judge people or judge the morality of the choices that they make and the actions that they take in society. Also, evaluation of the ethics of legislation. So whether certain legislation is good, like objectively, morally good or not, whether things are inherently discriminatory, whether they isolate people as opposed to help them. These are all ethical considerations of legislation. And there's some legislation that could potentially be good for some people, but they trade off the very basic and fundamental rights of the vulnerable in society. And that's why as progressive, we probably would consider those things to be immoral and will not support them. Finally, it's just a consideration of morality and or rights when making certain statements or tactics. In terms of political strategy, the sort of tactics that you take in parliament, how you want to go about achieving your political outcomes. These are all things that are subject to moral considerations as well. So these are all part of political moralism. And the government side is saying that they should abandon the political moralism and take a more amoral stance and more utilitarian or like a pro-utilitarian approach. towards politics. Okay, I hope that's clear. The second thing then is to identify the comparative in the round. And this is very important because especially because debates are sometimes quite nuanced, it is usually not a comparison between something or like and nothing, but usually between more or less of that particular thing. So there's a scale comparison to be made in a lot of different debates. And that scale comparison can become quite important, especially when there are problems that already exist to some extent on the other side. Increasing those problems probably is not that much more worse given diminishing returns. At the same time, there's also things like tipping point analysis, which is where there's an asymmetric increase in one value while decreasing another. Okay, I need an example to explain this. I think we'll have an example later on, so we'll look at that later. Okay, so in terms of comparative identification, the first thing you must do to identify the primary comparative in the motion, and I say primary here because debates often involve a lot of different dimensions, and there can be many different comparatives in the round, especially between different arguments, different stakeholders, different outcomes, etc. But there is the primary comparative that needs to be identified first, which is where all of the arguments stem from. This is a value judgment motion. It's a supports motion, which requires team to characterize and debate the most likely counterfactual in the debate, right? So government would probably prefer a world where progressive no longer practice political moralism. The opposition prefers a world where progressive continue to practice political moralism. And while the comparative here is, I think is rather obvious and straightforward, how these two things manifest, or how these two worlds manifest and how they differ, is where the greatest portion of the debate accrues, because that's the difference, or like the split in the round. What does it look like? This will require you to do characterization and world building. It's an important aspect that needs to be fleshed out in prep as well. We'll look more at that when we talk about the world building. But at this point, being able to identify the comparative will help you in the next part, which is to identify the burdens of proof. Okay, so in terms of the comparative identification, what does abandoning political moralism look like? It essentially is the prioritization of political expediency over morality when making certain political decisions. So what this looks like is probably things like cooperating with other political parties, individuals or organizations that maybe don't align with your values. Maybe these are people that you consider to be immoral or have done things that go against your values as progressive. For instance, not taking actions that are like objectively right because it will cost you politically. So not calling out the ruling government for unethical practices in order to preserve your political capital. A very good example of this actually is Syed Saddiq when he was still an MP who was sort of pressed to defend LGBT rights. Although in Malaysia, it's probably not something that's going to make you very popular with the rest of the politicians, given that we live in a pretty religiously conservative country. And so here, even though something is right or something ought to be done, if doing that hurts your like political capital in the future, you probably would prioritize your capital in this case because you are prioritizing political expediency over morality. Last thing here is just mudslinging campaigns, similar to what Trump did to Hillary in the 2016 US presidential elections. He just shat on her so hard that even though he didn't really have a lot of functional policies on his campaign, he was able to edge the election just by making his opponent look worse. And I think most of us would agree that's probably not something moral or not something good to be done in the political arena. But if you don't care about morality, that's one of the things that is one of the tactics that are on the table for you. Comparatively, in opposition, or like in the status quo, retaining political moralism is just the flip. It is prioritizing morality over political outcomes. For instance, not associating with actors, groups, or organizations that are deemed to be immoral, even if it could bring you political benefits. It looks like standing up for what you believe to be right, regardless of the cost. It looks like rising above the conflicts and taking the higher road, as opposed to being petty and engaging in mudslinging campaigns. So it's just the opposite here, but it's important to identify the comparative. You'll note that here there's a little bit of overlap between the comparative analysis as well as the world building. Later on, we'll look more specifically into why world building itself is quite important. But I think especially in terms of the identification of the burden, being able to flesh out the comparative to a reasonable degree, or at least to some degree, you can't just leave it as with moralism versus without moralism. There needs to be some discussion of context in order to identify what you need to defend and what you need to prove. Which leads to the next thing here, with regards to burden identification. What do you need to prove on your side of the house to win the debate? So burdens of proof. Your burden is essentially what you need to prove in your side to win the round. It's quite straightforward. There are two types of burdens. The first is primary burdens, which you have to discharge if you want to have a chance to win. The second is like secondary burdens, optional burdens, or extra burdens that you can take on if you want to prove a greater scale of an impact. You want to prove like a long-term benefit argument. You want to bring in some secondary or tertiary stakeholder into the debate. You can do that, but your primary burden needs to be taken first. So primary burdens are basically burdens that are placed on teams by virtue of the wording of the motion. These burdens are not negotiable. If you don't discharge the primary burden, you will lose the debate 99% of the time. And the other 1% of the time where you don't lose, it is because the other side didn't discharge their burden either. Okay, so being able to identify that primary burden is the key aspect to prep, because it, like, having the grasp of the burdens in a round will help you know what is and isn't relevant material. If you spend time talking about irrelevant material, you're not helping your case, you're not increasing your winning chances. So having a strong grasp on burden and being able to identify it is a very, very important thing. Burdens of proof are also sometimes called your win condition. It's the same thing, what you need to meet in order to win the round. If you don't do that, your chances of winning are quite low. So that's with regards to primary burdens. With regards to secondary burdens, these are additional burdens that you can take on in addition to your primary burden. I don't encourage teams to take on secondary burdens. Usually you think it is easy to discharge, but the reality is that it's not. And not just do you have to defend your primary burden, which is usually to prove that the benefits outweigh the harms or whatever, but you also need to defend then your secondary burden if you want it to have value in the round. Just one thing important to note, if you take on a secondary burden, but you fail to discharge it, you don't lose the debate outright. Instead, talking about these things, like the 2 to 3 minutes of a 7-minute speech that you spend talking about it, it just does not bring you any value, especially if the opposition is able to wash it out or just to disprove it altogether. So that's why it's not going to lose you the debate. However, if you talk about the secondary impacts at the expense of the primary clash in the round, and you, as a result, fail to prove your primary burden, it could cost you the debate. And especially if you're not clear as to what is and isn't within the scope of your primary burden, it can get a bit hairy. You might not know what to prioritize. So I discourage people from taking on secondary burdens. But if you want to do so, be aware of the risk associated with it. Okay, so this debate is about assessing whether progressives should abandon political moralism or not, like whether they should abandon it, whether they shouldn't. The Gulf burden is simply to show that abandoning political moralism brings greater benefits than harms, and the ops burden is to show that it brings greater harms than benefit. It's a common rookie mistake to say that the burden is just to show it brings benefits. And that's not necessarily true, given that in order for debates to exist, the things we are talking about they have to be controversial. There has to be a trade-off made somewhere, which means that this move is probably going to bring benefits and harms, like both positive and negative externalities. The question is which is more important or which is greater? Do the benefits outweigh the harms, or vice versa? And that's what the clash is going to be about. The opposition burden here is just the converse, to show that political moralism brings greater show that the abandoning of political moralism brings greater harm than benefits. Sorry, just typo there. But yeah, the primary burdens are just flipped. One side says benefits outweigh the harm. The other side says harms outweigh the benefits. Things quite straightforward here. Okay, I hope that's clear. The next part to the case construction is world building. How do you envision this world to look like? So it's related quite strongly to the comparative identification, but here is probably where you want to spend some time explicitly like fleshing out what the world looks like. And probably, I think this is the point where you want to start writing a lot of things. So the previous three aspects, the burden identification, the comparative identification, as well as the decomposition of the motion, are things that you can discuss verbally with your partner. If you want to write them down, it's fine as well. But the world building is what needs to come out in the prime minister or the first proposition speaker, right? It's what you envision your side of the counterfactual to look like, and you need to establish it at the top of the debate in order to firstly have a clear comparative benefit, a clear comparative to which to weigh your benefit against the opposition. But second, in order to prevent your opponents from capitalizing on the lack of characterization and fleshing out the counterfactual in a way that's not strategic to your side of the house. So do it at the start, get ahead of the competition. If you don't, you'll be on the back foot, and then your second speaker will have a very high bar to meet in order to do that. Yeah. Cool. So this is an analysis debate. It requires team to set up and describe the most likely counterfactual in the round. It's tied quite closely to comparative analysis that we did earlier. So note with analysis motions like this, the most likely counterfactual is up for challenging. There's no fiat here. Teams need to explain their version of reality is more likely than not to be true. Okay, so if Guff says that the counterfactual here, where we abandon political moralism, is I don't know, amazing political compromise, passing all the policies that you want in the world, because for some reason everyone's going to do that. Then in opposition, you probably want to challenge that being the likely counterfactual, to look at the incentive structures of other political organizations, other politicians and political parties, the extent to which they're willing to compromise in the best case of government, and whether they actually get those benefits. So challenging the counterfactual is perfectly legitimate within the rights of the opposition in this round. There's no fiat for Guff to say that this is the counterfactual, therefore this is what we must debate. So specifically for this motion is an analysis motion, but for policy debates, and I'll just note that this also includes modeling. So in policy motions, the government team gets fiat to set up the policy in the way that they envision it to materialize in society. And the reason why you want to have a functional model is to make it clear how things work. You want to implement the policy in a way that's strategic, in a way that actually creates positive outcomes for society. It also helps to preempt the logistical/efficacy challenges from the opposition. So example that I like to use to prove or to explain what fiat is in the motion of banning guns. On government, you have the fiat to create collection centers that is funded by taxpayer money in order to repurchase guns from people at above the market rate. Okay, and it is not within the prerogative of the opposition to say that this is probably going to be very costly or cost a lot of money, because the government gets fiat to implement the policy in the way that they envision it and the way that they want to. Obviously, the extent of fiat is to say that the model will exist, whether it brings greater benefits, whether it creates outcomes that are effective. All of this needs to be proven analytically in the round. Okay, so I hope that's clear. It's important to have counterfactual analysis in analysis debates. So what is the government's counterfactual in this round? As in a world where you abandon political moralism. And I'll just note that the status quo, which is what op defends, I mean, it does need to be characterized as well, but I think that there's probably a lot less contention about the status quo, given that there's a lot of fact-based examples that are a bit hard to disprove in debates, especially if you know what's happening in the world. So that's why the status quo is the less contentious counterfactual in the debate. The Gov's counterfactual then probably looked like cooperating with Republicans and other political parties, horse trading favors to get legislation passed, looks like catering to conservative power bases to gain capital and support, even if they do things that oppose your values, again, because you're prioritizing political expediency. Number three, refraining from challenging oppressive power structures or seeking lesser, more moderate changes instead of large-scale disruptive changes that are likely to face a degree of backlash from the conservative factions of society. So probably examples of this, like some access to abortion in Texas, whereas in the status quo, abortion is not legal. Maybe in some cases like necessity, in cases where there's a direct threat towards the mother's life, in cases of rape, for instance, you want to get access towards abortion, whereas in the status quo, you don't have access towards that. And that's very damaging. So even if you can achieve some small incremental change here, that's still a net benefit for the women who live in Texas. In the ideal world, you would want to get free for all access to abortion, but that's probably not very realistic. So this is what you can get if you make some compromises as opposed to refusing to make any compromises whatsoever. Someone asked, when the burden is to show more benefits than harm, is it a good idea for Gov to list out harms or should you wait for Op to bring them up? So I personally am not a fan of this preempting strategy from the PM, like Op might say this, Op might say that. Like, firstly, because like while they might say it, they also might not, depends on the strategy they choose to take in the round. The second is that time spent pre-butting arguments is time not spent building your own arguments. And given that if you pre-but the argument, then what your opponents do is that they just rebut it back in order to prove their arguments. And like clearly they want to do that because they want to run their harms. So I feel it is more strategic, instead of sort of preempting the arguments or the harms that Op might run, to instead explain specifically the benefits you achieve in your world, you accrue in your world, and then to sort of ground it by weighting the impacts as to why this benefit is going to outweigh any potential harm that opposition brings. And like probably while the exact harm or the mechanistic analysis may be a bit difficult to foresee at times, I think the primary trade-off is usually quite foreseeable. So you can explain reasons why you win that trade-off from the start, right from Prime Minister, which is like the preemptive weighing that is, I think, probably the more strategic way to go about things, as opposed to like listing out the harms from the opposition that they could potentially bring. Okay, I hope that answers the question. Okay, moving on then to the opposition's counterfactual. And again, when I say Op's counterfactual, I mean Op's characterization of the world where you are abandoning political moralism, right? So this probably looks like abandoning the core principles of the movement, things like equality or fairness, etc. It looks like selling out the vulnerable within the movement, subjecting them to societal discrimination and state oppression because it is convenient to do so. It looks like siding with right-wing conservatives for certain policies in the expectation or in the hope that they will reciprocate the favor without any guarantee that they will do so in the long term. So if you note here, the Gov, then the way you want to characterize the counterfactual on the Gov's world is to make it sound good, describing how you get potential benefits, and on opposition, you want to describe it in a way that's negative, showing how it leads towards that set of harms. And again, what is most likely to be true is up for contention between both sides, and it's probably necessary for both sides to contend the other's interpretation of the counterfactual. But the point here is that all of this discussion, all of this world building stuff needs to happen in prep time. It needs to happen either during the construction of the arguments or before you even construct those arguments in the first place. Right, I hope that's clear. The last part of this then is basically where we construct the arguments itself and why those things are particularly valuable. Okay, so let's just firstly go through very quickly the structure of an argument. So the basic structure of an argument, and this is not the only way that you can construct an argument, but I think it's probably one of the clearest and the easiest way to demonstrate argument construction. The first part of the argument that has to exist is the label, is the title, it's like the claim or the assertion that you want to prove through this argument. Okay. The second part of the argument is the process analysis or the mechanism or the mechanistic analysis, explaining how this claim, how this outcome materializes, how it happens, why the claim is true. Here's where you want to insert the characterization or the contextualization in order to prove that the claim is true or it is materially true in this round, so that the flow-on impacts and the benefits that you want to attach to the initial claim carries weight and needs to be considered by the adjudicator as well. The third thing then, or the third part to the argument, is where a lot of novices debaters miss out, which is the impact. So asking yourself, what is the impact? What is the importance of this argument? Or assuming I proved this, like, so what? Or what then? You know what I mean? So that's the impact or the importance or the relevance of the argument. And it needs to be explained explicitly why it is important. And again, the scale of the impact matters as well. Most things are, like, I guess, like relatively intuitively true to some extent. So it then becomes not whether the claim you are talking about is true in the first place, but the extent to which it is important and the extent to which it is valuable. And that's why very clear and explicit impacting is required. The last thing then is the comparative or the conclusion. So why then is the claim that you're making exclusive to your side? Why then are these benefits or outcomes that your opponents cannot co-opt or does not exist in, like, their world? So this requires you, again, to be aware of the comparative worlds in this debate, to identify the differing points or the points of differentiation, what makes it different, and what then makes this impact particularly exclusive to your side of the house. That's the basic structure of an argument. And again, there are many ways to build an argument. There are many ways to structure it. You can put the impacts first before the mechanisms. You can put the comparative at the top. Some people, they like to frame the entire argument as a comparative in the first place. You can do that. It's up to you. I prefer to put comparatives at the end. So yeah, whatever floats your boat lah. But the core aspects of the argument must be present in order for it to hold water in the round. Okay, let's look at the government side of the house. I'm going to construct the first argument for this motion. So I hope at this point, the burden analysis and the comparative identification is all clear, because the rest of the case prep is to a large extent very dependent on the first stage or the initial stage of you being able to identify the burdens. Because obviously, if you misidentify the burdens, if you identify them wrongly, then the arguments that you create are not going to forward your burden and may not necessarily benefit you in the round. So on the government side, it says that don't want morality, not important. Why should progressive abandon political moralism? So the first thing that I think is, or at least the clearest benefit or the clearest outcome that would run on Gov, is that doing so is the fastest or the more efficient way to achieve the political end goals of the progressive movements. So the first thing you need to prove is what these goals are. They need to be explained and needs to be characterized. The second is then mechanistically how these goals are going to be achieved through the abandoning of the political moralism. Again, a lot of mechanistic analysis needs to be done here. The third part is then the impacting as to why the speed of achieving political outcomes is valuable. Here you need to weigh the time frame as to why achieving things in the short term is probably more important, or at least bring a distinct value that is unlikely to occur in opposition. Lastly, then, why is it unlikely to happen in the ops counterfactual? Here's where you want to prove exclusivity by explaining specifically why this outcome is exclusive to your side. So you notice the conclusion here. It forwards the burden that this move brings benefits that outweighs the harm. So the benefit here is probably a faster, more efficient way to achieve political outcomes. And that is probably something good for the progressive movement insofar as the movement stands to push for social change. And like, this is the side that achieves the best form or the greatest pace of social change in society. Okay, let's do this. Political expediency. The first thing you need to prove, as stated earlier, is what these outcomes are. And here's where, if you have not characterized things in the setup of the PM speech, you want to put it inside the argument. So you can put it in the setup if you want. You can put it inside the argument. You probably don't want to put it in both, or like repeat the same things twice, even if they're different examples. So for the sake of efficiency, just choose where you want to place the analysis or the characterization, whether you want to put it in the setup or you want to put it inside the argument. So what's the problem in status quo? Things like political gridlock, polarization, and an unwillingness to cooperate. You have politicians and political parties on both sides of the aisle. They are extremely polarized, especially in the context of the US. They're unwilling to make compromises on values and or legislation, thus creating the gridlock that we see in Congress in the status quo. So given that progressives usually as a group are relatively small, they don't have sufficient capital to push through legislation. They lack the political will to push things like gender pay equality, access to abortion in more conservative places, and the like. I don't think there's any shortage of examples here. So things like labor unions, things like gender equality, things like public funding for gender reassignment surgery for the trans community, things like access to abortion, things like anti-discrimination laws, anti-harassment policies by corporations. These are all things that the progressive movements are trying to fight for. But the problem is almost always that the inertia that exists in the status quo, or the reluctance for people to shift away from the status quo, is what provides the strongest challenge to those things being effected. So that's the problem that exists, and these are the end goals that the progressive movements wants to achieve. The second part of the argument then is in terms of explaining how abandoning a moralism helps to achieve those end goals. And here's where you need to explain the process through which this outcome occurs. So things like morality, preventing progressive from working with people that they deem to be immoral. So for instance, politicians that are espousing regressive views, conservatives, etc., people that you don't necessarily like. These are people that could bring benefits if you are willing to work together. But the problem with having a very strong moral stance is that you are not willing to even be associated with those people in status quo. So the second way then is this, or like the same way rather, is that associating with those people, working together, allows you to create mutual benefits, which is what we call horse trading in parliament. It's like a political party saying to another party, if you support the bill that I am supporting, I will also give you votes to support the bill that you are supporting. And then at the end of it, both bills go through, as opposed to none if nobody cooperated in the first place. That's what horse trading is. The incentive for political parties and politicians to horse trade is because they both benefit. They benefit mutually through political compromise and stuff. And obviously, if you are like, if your ideologies are diametrically opposed, then you probably won't be able to reach any compromise. But the point here is that there are a lot of different issues that exist in society, and you want to or try to work together with people that like don't, where your end goals are not diametrically opposed. Basically, that's when there's the potential for compromise and horse trading to happen. And again, probably people are not going to give you the capital to support massive amounts of changes, especially those that require a significant amount of tax funding. However, the incentive of horse trading and compromise means you're probably able to achieve some small level of incremental changes. While it might not be massive, it is still significant over the long term, because it is those small little incremental changes that is how social progress is built, or how it occurs in reality today. And that's obviously contrasted to no progress at all in the opposition. So the second thing here is that you're probably able to cater to a significantly larger portion of the voting base by diluting the scale of liberalism. So even if you think that I don't know, maybe gender equality or the gender pay gap is something that is absolutely atrocious, you will probably settle for reducing it as opposed to, or reducing it marginally, as opposed to eradicating it completely, because that way you are more likely to get corporations on board And these are the corporations that will probably have to pay a bit more for their female employees if they're not already doing so in the status quo. And pushing for the complete eradication will either force them to cut the salaries of their male employees, which is just massively unpopular, and also the fact most of them are male, or they have to increase the salaries of their female employees, like to make up the difference. And that's again going to cost them profitability. So doing that means you're less likely to get corporation support, whereas diluting the scale to which you are pushing for these values is probably going to make it more likely that you get the support of those corporations at the end of the day. So that's how you cater to a significantly larger portion of the voting base by not pushing ideologies that will require them to take very radical shifts in their lives, which they're not likely to do, or to make changes that work against their interests. The third part to the argument then is impacting the claim and explaining why this is important. So why is some change preferable to none? The first thing to say is that gridlock prevents any progressive change at all. If it's true that progressives value actual social change, this is the best way to get it and to manifest it in reality. So what you can say then in terms of the comparative is that you have some small incremental change to the mode of government, and that's preferable to being like morally consistent or having very strong ideology in the world of opposition, if that ideology never manifests into any outcomes or any legislation in society. So then the comparative becomes some change against no change, and it does not matter the values that you espouse as a movement, as a group, as an organization, if those values remain abstract and do not translate to material impacts to society, right? So that's probably why small change is better than no change at all, even if it comes at the cost of your ideological purity. The second way you can weigh this urgency to be important is to explain the urgency to act, right? So, or like why the time frame is important. So things like access to abortion, access to gender reassignment surgery, these are things that are time-sensitive issues. Because if you don't get access to abortion, it's a direct threat to your life and the safety of the woman, especially if the pregnancy is unwanted. If you are like 16 or 17, your body is not like capable of carrying a baby to term. It's safer for you and I guess easier for your family and other people if the baby is aborted. But in a world where abortion is illegal and access towards it is exceedingly limited, it is less likely that you will get it, and therefore your safety and your health is threatened. And obviously, pregnancies last for 9 months. So if your legislation takes more than 9 months to come into effect, this lady is not going to be captured by it, and either is going to suffer massive complications or will have to carry the baby to term. Gender reassignment surgery also is time sensitive, given that it's harder for you to transition the older you are. The best time to transition is during or past puberty, because that's when hormonal changes have the most effect on your body. So again, not to say it's impossible to do so, but it's more effective if you do so at a young age. And again, even if these things don't sound very like important or impactful, you have to contrast the time frame of the opposition here. You're probably talking about decades of lobbying, of awareness campaigns and working things on the ground to get the kind of change that you want to see. And that's why in that 10 years, that 10 to 20 years that you are spending to fight for change, the number of people that are going to be hurt, that are going to be threatened, they're going to be exposed towards all sorts of discrimination, direct threats towards their health and safety is pretty significant. And that is why it is probably more important that we protect those vulnerable people in the foreseeable future through compromise and horse trading, as opposed to waiting for those things to shift in the long term. Right? Continue and sustain discrimination, societal oppression. These are things that are net negative. So it's an urgency to act, which is why the time frame comparison is important here, given that the sooner you act, the more people that you save and the more people that you help and benefit materially. So that's in terms of impacting the argument as to why expediency and utilitarian things are valuable. The last thing here is in terms of concluding the argument and explaining why it is exclusive. So why is expediency something that's not accessible by all? So without abandoning political moralism, other political actors and groups have no incentive to compromise or help you, right? Because they're not going to help you if they don't benefit in return. And that's why, unless there's some kind of mutual benefit, quid pro quo going on, there won't be any change happening. The second is that as a movement and as a group of people, progressives are always the minority because progressives are always pushing for social change and society is catching up with the progressives with the kind of social change that's happening if you look at history. So progressive will always be the minority. There will always be the left-wing liberals or the SJWs that are pushing for change. That means that, but it also means that because you are a minority, you won't have sufficient political capital to push that change through yourself. So the most that you can do if you don't make these compromises is to make a lot of noise in the media, to support informational campaigns and stuff, unless there is like very sudden societal shifts that grabs and like shifts public consciousness in some way. It is just very unlikely that progressives as a group on their own is capable of achieving any kind of meaningful change without getting the support of the rest of society. Meaning that while social change is possible in opposition and has happened throughout history, it is going to be exceedingly slow because you don't or you are not willing to make compromises, which means you need to wait for until you get enough political capital to support very basic policies. And those things subject the vulnerable to a lot of worse harms in the meantime. Conclusion of this is therefore abandoning political moralism enables progressive to effect social change at a greater rate, thus protecting more people. And then you can say we help the most vulnerable actor, which is why we win the debate. Yeah. Okay, so I hope that's clear. If there's anything you don't understand about the argument or how it's constructed, yeah, please do ask. Okay, let's talk about the opposition case then and the opposition arguments, which I think is probably where a lot of teams at UADC sort of had a hard time finding it, because I think that there's probably a very strong bias for utilitarianism in the debate circuit. So unless you know either A, how to find the mechanisms to win the utilitarian clash on opposition side, or to find this other non-contingent value that I'm going to argue in this round, it's probably hard for you to trade off the utilitarian gain in the Gauss world. So why is morality important? Here I make the very straightforward claim that the reason why we should maintain political moralism is just simply because it's something that's objectively good. There's an obligation to remain true to your values because it is like what defines you and is who you are. Note here, if I am able to prove firstly why this obligation exists, where this obligation stems from, the second is why it is important to maintain this stance or the impact of this principled analysis. Last thing then, just in terms of comparing how then should progressive push for change in terms of assessing efficacy, even if you have to trade off the time frame or the rate of change. Then you can see that this forwards the out burden to suggest that this move brings a harm with regards to the renegation of your obligation. And this harm is important enough that it outweighs the benefits that Gov could potentially push in the round. Okay, so let's talk about this obligation and where it stems from. Where does this obligation come from? The first thing to note in terms of proving why this obligation exists is to understand why it's fair to place an expectation on the progressives as a group to act in this particular way as opposed to others. And the first thing you can say here to prove this is the reciprocal duty that the progressive movement has towards its followers, its supporters, and its members. And the reason why this reciprocal duty exists is because these followers and these members have contributed significantly towards the movement. They have contributed, they have sacrificed, they have placed themselves at significant risk in order to forward social change. Or these are people who have been directly harmed by social injustice and have sought change through the movement. So for instance, it looked like the BLM protesters who were risking jail time or police violence when they came out to protest, when they came out to riot, for instance. And every single person that came to riot added value to the protest, added urgency and impact to the protest, and eventually the BLM movement as a whole successfully stripped qualified immunity from police officers, which is why Derek Chauvin is being charged with murder right now. I think the court case has some development, haven't been keeping up that. But the point here is that they took risks to forward the cause of the movement, and that's why the movement owes a reciprocal obligation to help them. The second is examples of supporters that have contributed financially to the movement. So if they have funds, they have money, they could have spent it on themselves, they could have spent it on literally anything else in the world. They chose to spend it or to donate it to the movement in the hopes or in the expectation that this movement is going to use those funds to forward progressive ideologies in a way that meaningfully benefits society, right? So these are people that are sacrificing the opportunity cost of those funding in order to contribute to the movement, and therefore they expect you to use the money well. The third thing is probably like victims of social injustice. So for instance, victims of sexual harassment. If they've been victim blamed, if the police doesn't believe them, police have refused to investigate these instances, like corporations and companies refuse to take steps to overcome or to deal with those issues. For instance, these are people that come to the movement because the movement have promised to push for change, have promised to protect them at various points in order to get their support, in order to include them in the movement, or for no other reason than the reason why these people come into the movement in the first place is because they expect or they hope that this movement will be able to push for change. And yeah, I will just note that there is probably some significant overlap between the three stakeholders that I talked about, between people that sacrifice, people that donated, and people that are hurt by social injustice. These can be the same group of people across the board. But the point here is that because these people contributed to the movement, the expectation that the movement would push for like its ideological values, that is what imposes an obligation on the movement to maintain its value here. Yep. Yeah, so the expectation, pushing for progressive values, the movement and its leaders owed an obligation to this community to continue the fight against injustice and to these people. So all of this analysis proves that the obligation is true, right? And once this obligation is proven, then it does not matter what benefits or what is in the interest of the movement. So long there's a duty to act in a certain way, it is what they ought to do, regardless of the outcomes. Okay, so that's one of the ways that you can challenge utilitarian arguments, just by providing, in this case, it's a deontological challenge to the utility argument. So why is this obligation important? It's in terms of the principal impacting of this, as well as that it also leads to pragmatic outcomes. So the first thing is just with regard to the principal obligation, you owe it to the members of your movement to do so, regardless of outcome that is expected of you. So this is what we call like a non-contingent argument or a non-contingent claim, that this claim exists, and once it is proven to be true, it still holds true regardless of what it leads to in terms of an outcome, right? So it's, for example, the duty of the parents to take care of their kids. And like parents sometimes choose to indoctrinate their kids into religion. Like, is this good for the kid? Most of us would probably say it's not very good for the kid. But given the obligation is on the parent to care for the child, and the parent thinks that this is, you know, a good way to care for the child, it is within their rights to do so. In fact, it's arguably it is their responsibility to immerse the kid in religion because they think it is the best way to raise the kid. So that's like a non-contingent claim. It does not depend on outcomes, and the claim still holds true, even if you win the clash on utility, or you lose the clash on utility rather in this case. The second impact to this obligation analysis is simply to show that if you renege on the obligation and if you betray your duty to your followers, it's just less likely that they'll remain your followers and they'll just leave the movement as a whole. So pragmatically, the movement is likely to lose its core members if leaders decide to be principally inconsistent. So you lose supporters, you lose donations, etc. And specifically here, when we talk about movements, it is usually the people who are the most invested in the movement that brings the most value to the movement, right? So the environmentalist is the people that go out and hug trees that add the most value to the movement. Like, I think there's across a spectrum of different people that are part of the progressive movement or that consider themselves progressives. A lot of them just, sit at home and share articles on Facebook. They don't really add a lot of value to the movement, but it's the people that actively go out there, campaign, protest, participate in lobbying and stuff, open those civil societies that draft legislation. These are the people that add the greatest value to the movement, but are also the people that have the greatest expectation of the movement to be consistent, or at least to maintain their ideological purities and not sell out to the Republicans. So you lose supporters, you lose donations, and you can impact these supporters or the subset of supporters that you lose as being particularly valuable to the movement with regards to pushing for change. The third thing you can say in terms of a harm is why the most vulnerable people in those movements are harmed. Either they are harmed by being exposed to greater harm. So if, say, you are a victim of sexual harassment, you come to the progressive political party so that they can try to push for stronger laws against sexual harassment. And they decide that, oh, it's very unpopular to push for this law, so I guess I won't push for it. Then, like, as a victim, you're just hurt. Like, there's no one out there that's willing to stand for you, right? And therefore, it's not just true that you have been harmed and you have been failed by the progressive movement. It is also true that you are likely to be exposed to worse harms in the future, especially if you have, if your identity is known, if you are like a public whistleblower, for example, you could face worse forms of retaliation, especially if the movement does not take steps to protect you. Like, I mean, obviously in these things, probably the responses will be like, we still have our values, we'll still try to protect you to some extent. The question will then become like, the extent to which you're able to protect them. And clearly, if you are trying to pander to conservatives, then you're not going to be able to do things that are liberal. It's a trade-off you have to make. The last thing then about how these people are harmed. So it's not just that they're exposed to greater harm in status quo, they'll also probably be disillusioned with the movement. They'll become politically apathetic. They don't see any more hope. They don't see any more optimism for the future. And that's why they opt out of the movement. They opt out of politics entirely. They don't think that anyone's there to protect them. And because these people are particularly vulnerable, there's just a greater obligation on us as a progressive community to try to protect them, to take steps to intervene where they're unable to do so of their own accord. So that's how you say the vulnerable people are harmed on opposition. The last part of the argument then is sort of drawing the comparative with regards to pushing for change. And I've just flagged here that this line of analysis probably isn't really like principled in nature. Like, it's the first two things that we've proven with regards to the principle application that stands. But I think that in opposition, you probably have to discuss to some extent how you get social change in your work, not just to mitigate the stuff in Gulf with regards to them getting a lot of utility, but also being able to suggest in terms of comparison why it's often through long-term sustained political and social change that creates the best types of change for society. So how then should progressive push for social change? So it looks like continuing to espouse very high standards of morality, refusing to condone bad actions by bad actors, continuing to call out politicians, leaders, and corporations for bad decisions made that hurt others, like the Kellogg company in the US, the one that produces breakfast cereals. 14,000 of their workers are on strike now because the company has actually increased their profitability during the COVID pandemic while workers are paid less, and like a lot of them have been laid off. So they are striking now, and people are calling out the company for exploitative labor practices. It also looks like shifting social discourse and awareness through grassroots awareness campaigns, infographics, and social media, etc. be the Bernie Sanders of the world, basically. So Bernie Sanders, very progressive politician, democratic socialist, supports a lot of policies that are very, I would say, good for society, but there just is not sufficient political will within the US democratic system to get those things implemented. So it's the fact that his voice exists that's in itself a value by shifting the overturn window of social discourse. So the overturn window argument is basically to say that, so it's like this. Let's say you want to ask someone for $5, okay? If you just go up there and say, can you give me $5? They probably won't give you the $5 because why would I give you $5 for no reason? You know what I mean? But if you instead go and ask them first for $100 and then say, no, obviously not, you then ask for $5 instead. That request becomes a lot more reasonable in comparison to the initial request and increases the likelihood of that person giving you the $5. So that's basically what the overturn window is that if you stand or push and espouse a viewpoint that is considered extreme by society right now, so you push like extreme left viewpoints, the center point of social discourse shifts to the left ever so slightly, because when you espouse for things like, I don't know, radical action, things like basic legislation, so if you espouse things like a global Marxist revolution through violence or whatever, then what seems very reasonable in comparison to that is, giving workers labor rights, giving them minimum pay, giving them health benefits and stuff, because if they don't do that, it could lead towards violence in the future. However, the demands now you're making now seem a lot more reasonable in comparison. So that's basically the overturn window argument and how you can make it work here. You can, aside from just talking about Bernie Sanders, and I would point that Bernie Sanders also affected the overturn window, given that the Medicare for All plan was debated both by Biden and Trump during the presidential debates, which shows that just having greater awareness in the public consciousness is in itself a value with regards to bringing those issues to the forefront or bringing those issues into the limelight so that they can be discussed. That's in itself a value. Aside from Bernie Sanders, you can also look to the various aspects of history. Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King, leader of the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panthers, Malcolm X. These are people that have often shifted the discourse in a way that seemed radical at the time, but in retrospect was, number one, very much necessary, but two, eventually brought about greater social change because of the shift in public consciousness. So all of these things mean that change can still happen in opposition. It's probably a bit slower, but it is inevitable. But more importantly, it is more lasting in ops world. A, because you don't fraternize with people who are immoral. But second, the process of compromising, bargaining, and sacrificing your morals whenever it's convenient also tends to reduce your credibility as a movement. And that's why even if you do achieve some degree of incremental positive changes in the world of gov, the likelihood of those change being sustained, being carried forward into the future is just reduced. And also the fact that, if you are trading off values, this for that, it is, if you trade off, I don't know, something in order to get greater access to abortions today, there's no reason why you would not trade off this greater access to abortion for some other value tomorrow, which means you don't necessarily get the incremental changes. You get sporadic changes here and there, depending on what is most convenient for you. So in terms of weighing the sustainability of that change, in terms of weighing the number of people that you protect into the long term, moving social morals forward is the only true way to change the consensus and the moral consensus of society. And that change is eventually going to be reflected in the next generation of politicians, next generation of voters, when they come out to the election polls and choose politicians to represent them. Okay, so I think that's more or less the argument for opposition, right? The conclusion of the argument again is that not just is shifting to or shifting away from political moralism, a failure of the principled duty of the movement as a whole. It also weakens the movement's capacity to push for change in the future, whereas you get more lasting and sustained change in opposition if you maintain your stances and your high standards of morality and not like, interact with a lot of people that you deem to be negative. Thus, proving the burden that abandoning moralism creates more harms than benefits, or at least worse harms comparative to benefits, which means that progressive people probably shouldn't do that at the end of this debate. Right, so I hope that's clear. So that's more or less it for the case construction argument, case construction workshop. I hope that the process of constructing a case is clear and understandable. And if there's any questions, anything that you don't understand, now's the time to ask. Okay, so I'm just gonna have a look at the document and see whether people have submitted questions to be answered, in which case I will answer them right now. Can the presentation be shared? Yes, I don't mind sharing the presentation with you all. So we have two questions. Firstly, how the tip and tricks to rebuttal. So this isn't a rebuttal workshop specifically. I think we will have another workshop focusing on rebuttal, but the short version of how to do rebuttal is basically two things. To firstly ask whether the premise of the claim is true itself, which is the first step, denying the premise. The second step is to say, assuming the premise is true, does it lead to the conclusion? So let's say in the argument that I made earlier with regards to political expediency. So my first claim is that this is the fastest way to achieve political angles through things like political moralism, or the abandoning of political moralism rather. So the first step to rebutting the claim is to ask whether this claim is even true in the first place. Is it true that this is the fastest way to achieve political outcomes? Are there any other alternative mechanisms that do exist? And I think there are some, probably not on the same scale, at least like structurally speaking. Most alternative mechanisms will take a significant amount of time, especially if you want to maintain your morality and stuff. So that initial premise is not something that you can like deny, you know what I mean? So then the second step is to ask, assuming this is the way to go about things, is it then true if you abandon your moralism that you are able to achieve your end goals? And here's where you just question the mechanisms, like how likely is it that right-wing conservatives are going to be willing to negotiate with you, or horse trade with you in the first place? How likely is it that the moderates are going to support you? To what extent are you going to be able to achieve outcomes and compromise? Like, given you also have to give up some capital in order to get this horse trading to work in the first place. So then you question those mechanisms and whether it's actually true that if you abandon your morality, you actually get outcomes at the end of that. Last thing then is to do the even if thing. The sort of saying, even if it's true that you do get greater expediency, that's a more important value we should preserve in this round. And that's probably like your obligation to the movement, the members within those movements that supported you all this while, and will still expect you to continue supporting them. The second question is, may you know my Instagram? I haven't opened my Instagram in a long time. I think if I'm not wrong, you can search up Revan_TJ. That should be my Insta handle. I will probably accept your request in a month from now. I'm really not active on Instagram. What is the best way to set up a policy debate? Like if you're asking specifically about modeling policy debates and stuff, I think that the most effective and the most realistic models that you will see in debates come from or are built off existing models that happen in society. So for example, if you ever are involved in a debate about legalizing sex work or about legalizing drugs, or let's talk about legalizing drugs, probably the more realistic way to go about modeling the legalization of drugs is to look at the Amsterdam model, where they don't directly give drugs to people who are over the age of 18, like given their very clear concerns with these drugs leaking out to minors and stuff. Instead, they create like lounges where you can go there and they have bongs set up and everything, and you can get high inside there. So that's how you get access to drugs in Amsterdam. At least that's one way you can get access to drugs. And like the reason why this model is probably better than a free-for-all access is because you can control access to a far greater extent. You need registration to even get into the bar in the first place. And if you're not old enough, you not going to get access, and it's just not going to leak outside, or the likelihood of it leaking is a lot less. Second thing is that you can control the amount of drugs that people consume. So if they consume, like if they are smoking up every single night, then that probably suggests that they're addicted to it. And having or knowing this means that you can take steps to like have an intervention now, or like certain laws that can say you cannot consume more than how many grams of marijuana within a certain time period. If you do, then they will force you to go for drug rehabilitation because you're addicted and stuff. So I would say that the most effective way to set up models is to model it based on existing real world scenarios. And like this will require you to read a lot, to read and be aware of what's happening in the world around us. Aside from that, the other way to model strategically is to, I guess, watch more debates. So if you watch more debates, you see senior debaters setting up models, then they may include things that you previously did not think of before. Or if you've done a policy debate and your opposition has like this very annoying harm that you just cannot get rid of, you can't trade it off, for instance, it's probably quite possible that you can model it or mechanize it out of the wrong. But if you weren't aware of how to do it, then you can learn that. Yeah, and then I get the last way just through trial and error. Yeah, pain. Pain is the best teacher. Okay, next question. How can we think of debate winning arguments? What aspects should we pay more attention to once we have a debate motion? So the aspects that you need to pay attention to specifically is the comparative analysis, the burden identification, and the contextualization of the debate. So these are the things that I focus on at the very start of the workshop. And these are things that you must do in every single motion, every single debate that you are involved in. So once you get those things down to a fine art where it just becomes muscle memory, becomes second nature to you, then you have more time to focus on the strategizing, focusing on time spent on certain argumentations and stuff to decide the best strategy. How do you think of debate winning arguments? So I believe that there is no such thing as silver bullet argumentation. I think there are in certain instances where the motion balance is not correctly assessed, there can be something that comes close to it. But I think that every single argument that you run has the potential to be winning on its own. And the way to find or to assess whether the argument is winning is to look at the impact of the argument or the value that it adds towards the round, and the trade-off or the comparison for this value against the value of your opponents. Okay, so for example, in this debate, the reason why the political expediency argument is prioritized in the Gov case, given it's the only argument I'm going to build, is because the impact of the argument is quite strong, given that you are able to accrue policy change, social change in society that probably would not exist in the opposition. You can then push this impact to become a winning advantage in the round by explaining why the urgency requires us to act now. The number of people that we protect requires us to maximize utility with regard to the amount of protection we can get. And the fact that we achieve some kind of tangible, visible change that people will appreciate in society means that the movement is more credible or more recognized as a whole. These are reasons as to why the argument is impactful, but more importantly, you can push those impacts to eventually become debate winning themselves. So any argument can be debate winning, but some arguments are easier to win than others. The way to assess it is by looking at the impacting of the impacts of the argument. Next question. What is the best practice in order to prep for policy debate? I mean, I don't see why prepping for policy debates is meaningfully different than prepping for any other debates. Like, probably the hardest part about a policy debate is like mechanizing the model or like modeling the policy in a way that makes sense. The one thing that I'll say about policy debates though is that on Gov, and I guess on Op as well, you have to be aware of the possibility of opposition running a counterprop. So symmetry of fiat, you have this amount of money to use to run your model. Opposition gets to do gets access to the same amount of money, and they can use it however they want. So for example, in debates about, let's say, abolishing prisons, then the op has counter fiat to say they want to prop reforms towards the prison system, reduce things like overcrowding within the prisons, increase access to rehabilitative measures or like mental health counseling and stuff. Like, these are all things that op can do, give the same amount of capital and tax funds that the government is using to abolish prisons and stuff. So I don't know how to answer the question. How do you prepare for policy debates? Like, just be aware that counterprops exist as a tactic. Be aware that you have access to fiat. You have access to a lot of tax funds on Gov as well. So while money is not the solution to everything, it is the solution to most things. So you have more tax funds. You can plug those tax funds into things that potentially could be beneficial and could help your case as well. I hope that's helpful. I don't know how else to answer the question. How if we meet people really cool, also confused to be rebuttal cause they being cool? Huh? Okay, maybe you are a bit cool because I am confused by what you're trying to ask here. I presume if you are confused by the things that they are saying, it either means that they are not explaining it well or they are speaking too fast. So if you don't understand what someone is saying on the floor, it is a very high likelihood that the judge does not understand it either. The most effective speakers do not speak at 100 words per minute and just like give verbal diarrhea. The most effective speakers speak at a reasonable pace in a way that is understandable to the average readable person. So if you really can't catch what the speaker is saying, you don't understand the rebuttal, probably what you want to do is to like flag in a POI and ask like, I don't understand what you're saying, can you slow down? It's possible that the judge doesn't understand it either and would like quite appreciate it. Or it's possible that they're just speaking too fast. Again, you can ask them to slow down. Or what I find to be most effective when dealing with this kind of speeches is to have a grasp of the burdens of the round and what they're supposed to prove. And then like you can sort of catch some words that they're trying to say that are, you know, lean towards that side of the burden more, and then sort of guess what they're trying to say and then rebut it. I think that's at most what I can do. But I would say that in situations where this does happen, if you don't understand what the speakers are saying, it's a very high likelihood the judge doesn't understand it either and will not be giving a lot of credit to the things that they say. Oh, they mean big debaters, facing big debaters. Well, I guess if your concern is facing people like with big names or with a lot of rep and stuff, I would say firstly that rep is often overhyped. It's like, yeah, you got a bunch of achievements. It doesn't mean that you are always good. And at least in my experience, it requires it requires a significant effort to maintain a competitive edge in debating. So if you haven't been debating for a while, you lose the edge and you lose out. So it doesn't matter whether they have name or not. Listen to the things that they are saying and listen to the argument itself. So rebut the argument. Once you isolate the argument from the speaker, being able to deconstruct the logical analysis, identifying the mechanisms, the impact, and the way you can deal with those things, that's the way to deal with it. The arguments are the same. Doesn't matter who the speaker is. Arguments are the same, responses are the same as well. Okay, someone asks, how to opt under the current pandemic? This house believes that it is unethical for nations to keep a surplus of medical supplies. And win. Or the and win part is a bit high demand. Okay, so I think that the way the motion is worded is basically requires the op to frame the debate in a way that revolves around morality specifically, as opposed to outcome. So probably the biggest job on the opposition, if they want to even have a chance of winning the round, is to be able to frame out utile outcomes as the metric to assess the debate. And I think that's probably quite challenging itself, given that there's a very strong utilitarian bias for this. So the challenge is whether you can use characterization or existing principles to suggest or explain why moral evaluations are usually not contingent on outcomes being good or bad, but rather an independent assessment of the act and the choice itself. That's probably the greatest challenge of that motion. Second thing then is to explain, I guess on off, like the strongest principle you want to run is like self-defense. So as richer nations, you hoard a lot of medical supplies, like vaccinations, like IV drips, like ventilators, for instance. These are things that you produce because you have greater capacity. But I guess the strongest analysis on op that you can say is with regards to vaccines, because it is the richer nations like the US through Operation Warp Speed that pump the greatest amount of funding into the vaccine developmental program, which is why we got vaccines for this pandemic in a record amount of time, like I think it's within a year or less. And so on that basis, given that they were the people primarily responsible for funding these vaccine efforts, it is only fair that they have a greater claim to the vaccines being produced there. And even if it's true, it comes at a cost of more vulnerable people in other parts of the world dying. It's still morally legitimate. Firstly, because it's their money, like taxpayers, their taxpayer money, and therefore those taxpayers deserve greater access towards it. The second is that without these tax funds in the first place, or without these efforts to fund those things, there would not exist a vaccine at all. And that's why, the creation of it grants them the right, or at least the first choice or the priority, whatever you want to call it. The last thing then is sort of, giving a whole bunch of reasons why it would probably distribute and trickle down to other people, like vaccine diplomacy or like donations and stuff. That's probably what you can do on op. Whether you can do it in a way that's winning, I think that is another question. but that's probably the two things you want to do to maximize your chances in opposition. What you can do on op is to hope and pray. Oh yes, hopes and prayers seldom did anything, but yes, makes you feel better. Random question, any memorable rounds from UADC 2021? Not really. They are just blended into each other after a while. Yep. Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Okay, I think it seems like there are not any more questions. So I can end the workshop here. So thanks very much, everyone, for coming. I hope you found the workshop helpful. If you have any questions after this, feel free to drop me a text on Facebook. I'll try to get back to you when I can. And for those who are coming for nationals, I hope to see you there. If you are eligible, you are a student at a Malaysian university, you are eligible to participate in nationals. And yeah, you should sign up. Registration is going to be closing soon. Yeah, so thank you very much once again. I'll see you soon.